Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 828, and today is August 14th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Now, I do have a little bit of extra stuff to plug here on the top. It's been a fairly busy week, an exciting week. I was back on Judging Freedom with Andrew Napolitano yesterday, so head on over, check out that episode, and be sure to leave a comment letting them know that you enjoyed my appearance on the show so they continue to have me on. Additionally, today on the Kyle Anzalone Show, 4:45 Eastern Time, you want to watch this one live. The great comic Dave Smith will be coming onto the show. I've been watching Dave's content for so long. I'm really excited to be able to sit down, talk with him today, hopefully laugh a little bit. So that'll be a special episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show today that you won't want to miss. To catch that episode and every episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It is the first link in the show notes page. Also want to mention that I have been just so busy writing this week that I actually have more stuff than I could possibly cover on conflicts of interest. So if you want to make sure you're catching all the articles, and especially as I put them out, make sure you're following me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. My articles appear at a variety of outlets, antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute primarily, and also over at judgenap.com. So the best place to just catch all of them is on my Twitter handle at KyleAnzalone_. All right, let's jump into and talk about some of the biggest stories that I've covered over the past week on the show today. Starting off here with this one from the Libertarian Institute, published on, this will be August 11th. The article's titled, "This is Liberation Day. Trump announces National Guard deployment in D.C." President Donald Trump announced that he would federalize the D.C. police and deploy National Guard to the nation's capital to address crime in the city. In a press conference, Trump said the city was unsafe, dirty, and disgusting, adding, "This is Liberation Day in D.C., and we're going to take our capital back. I'm officially invoking the District of Columbia Home Rule Act and placing the D.C. Metropolitan Police directly under federal control. The law allows for the president to federalize the D.C. police force for 30 days. To extend the action, he would need approval from Congress, and he's already talking about extending it past the 30-day deadline." He added, "In addition, I'm deploying the National Guard to help restore law, order, and public safety. The White House is planning to deploy 800 members of the National Guard to the nation's capital." Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said residents of D.C. would soon see the National Guard on the streets in the capital. He explained, "You will see them flowing into the streets of Washington in the coming week. At your direction as well, sir. There will be other units we are preparing to bring in, other National Guard units, specialized units. They will be strong, they will be tough, and they will stand with their law enforcement partners." Trump threatened to take similar steps in other major cities, but voiced hopes that some of them would self-clean up. He said, "If we need to, we're going to do the same thing in Chicago, which is a disaster." D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser called Trump's actions unsettling and unprecedented. Now, the other thing I would like to add here that I think is important, one of the I think really good parts of the Constitution in American history are that the role of the military, particularly in the United States, is limited. Now, I know the National Guard isn't the same as active duty soldiers, although, particularly during the global war on terror, many of our foreign military deployments were carried out by members of the National Guard. And so these are certainly people who have seen combat, who have been a part of occupying foreign nations, and having them occupy an American city, I do find to be disturbing. Now, the Constitution and U.S. law does put some restrictions on what the National Guard could do. I believe there's two primary ways that the president can deploy the National Guard to do vague law enforcement in the United States. One is to deploy them to defend, in particular, federal institutions and structures. And so I believe Trump wouldn't necessarily need the permission, not that he would in Washington, D.C., because that's a different story, but say if he did want to send them to Chicago, he wouldn't necessarily need permission from the political leadership of Illinois and the city of Chicago to do so. We saw that with the situation in L.A. Now, I believe the second move or legal authority Trump would have to deploy the National Guard to address law and order issues would be under Title 32. And under that, the National Guard would have more ability to enforce, law enforcement and work with law enforcement. But that would require the political participation and consent of the political leaderships of the states and cities that Trump is sending the National Guard to. Now, largely speaking, the Constitution is just a piece of paper that isn't really followed anymore. We see every day essentially how the federal government is bending and breaking the Constitution. I mean, how many wars is Donald Trump launching without congressional approval whatsoever? Strikes on Iran, a month-long bombing campaign in Yemen, and most recently, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit soon, his authorization for the military to start operations, including on foreign soil, against Latin American cartels. And so I don't count on the Constitution to constrain Trump here. And I think we could be looking at a somewhat disturbing level of militarization of the American police force with this move. Now, next up here, this article is a follow-up I wrote for the Institute on August 12th, and I think this is something that Hegseth was alluding to in his comments. Pentagon to create domestic civil disturbance quick reaction force. The Department of Defense is planning to create a rapid response force of National Guard troops to quickly deploy to American cities where protests or arrests are occurring. On Tuesday, the Washington Post reported that it obtained documents showing the Pentagon is creating a domestic civil disturbance quick reaction force. The plan calls for 600 troops to be on standby at all times so they could deploy in as little as 1 hour. The outlet explained they would be split into two groups, 300 stationed at military bases in Alabama and Arizona, with purview of regions east and west of the Mississippi, respectively. 100 troops at each base would be on standby to deploy within an hour, while the entire force would begin operations within 12 hours. The National Guard will be equipped with weapons and riot gear, and the deployment will be limited to 90 days to prevent burnout among troops. On Monday, Trump announced, so the day before, his major crackdown declaring Liberation Day, and the new quick reaction force may be deployed to other American cities if Trump perceives there is too much crime. Trump threatened to take similar steps in other major cities that he's taken in Washington, D.C., and the planned force could face legal barriers as it attempts to deploy to American cities. This was something that was acknowledged in the documents the Washington Post reviewed. All right, moving on here to this article that I wrote for JudgeNap.com on August 11th. President Sheinbaum says U.S. troops will not enter Mexico in response to Trump's order for the military to target cartels. So the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, vowed to defend her country's sovereignty following a report in the New York Times that President Donald Trump had authorized the military to take military actions against cartels. She said on Monday, "We will never put our sovereignty at risk. We will never put Mexico's independence at risk. Mexico is a free, sovereign, independent country. We collaborate to coordinate on security matters and others, but we will never subordinate ourselves, and we will never allow the U.S. Army or any other institution of the U.S. to set foot in Mexican territory." Now, One thing I just want to say, and this was noted by the Financial Times, the comments are focused on an intervention by soldiers on the ground, while Mexican security analysts are more concerned about the possibility of drone strikes, particularly in Mexico. And so I do wonder if with this, if she's trying to give herself some leverage here, if maybe the Mexican government is going to look the other way on a couple U.S. drone strikes in Mexico or something like that. And she's really just trying to make sure that the U.S. doesn't invade and then steal another big chunk of Mexican territory here. It's important to note that Mexico is the U.S.'s largest trading partner, and that Donald Trump has this plan that he has given the military the authority to carry out military force, including entering foreign soil to conduct military operations against the cartels. Now, while much of the focus in the media has been on Mexico, and you know, certainly in the American public perception, most cartels are from Mexico, but there are other countries that could be potential targets, El Salvador being one, as I believe that's home where MS-13 is based, one of the cartels that could be targeted by military action under Trump's order. But my suspicion is that we should be worried about Venezuela. They have listed Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization, and they claim that the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, is the leader of that cartel, and Washington has long-eyed regime change in Mexico. All right, so I want to take just a second to talk about the upcoming summit between Trump and Vladimir Putin here. Europe presses Trump to include Zelensky in summit with Putin. I wrote this one for the Institute on August 11th. America's European allies issued a statement directed at President Donald Trump that says Kiev must be involved in any agreement to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Trump is scheduled to hold a bilateral summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday. The joint statement issued by France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Britain, and Finland, along with the European Commissioner Chief Ursula von der Leyen, said the path to peace in Ukraine cannot be decided without Ukraine. And so overall here, the message is that Zelensky has to be included in any talks with Vladimir Putin. And if Zelensky says no to anything, the U.S. just has to adopt that position. The EU's top diplomat said the U.S. has the power to force Russia to negotiate seriously. Any deal between the U.S. and Russia must have Ukraine and the European Union included for it to matter of Ukraine's and the whole Europe's security. This was interesting. The German chancellor had strong words on this. Friedrich Merz said, "We cannot accept any case that territorial questions are discussed or even decided between Russia and America over the heads of Europeans and Ukrainians. I assume that the American government sees it the same way." Now, he's saying that we can't negotiate with Russia over the heads of Europe and Ukraine. We're the ones funding this war. This war is only going on because of the United States of America. And so, no, it wouldn't be over the heads of the Europeans. The Europeans are underneath us. They are operating because we allow them to. The Ukrainians are continuing to fight because the Americans continue to send weapons. And so if Trump wants to make a deal with Vladimir Putin, it would not be over the heads of the Ukrainians and the Europeans. It would simply be a deal for the benefit and in the interest of the American people. So it'll be interesting to see what happens at this summit. I know we've talked about it a lot this week, both on this program and the Kyle Anzalone show. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about Gaza today than getting into this. But I am interested to see what happens here. Trump has downplayed any possible, real deals coming out of this summit between Putin, saying that a second summit is coming. I think that's a good way to approach it. The U.S. and Ukraine and Russia still seem very far apart from reaching a deal. And so if there are low expectations for the first summit, essentially Trump and Putin are going to change proposals. We're going to go back to Washington. Trump's going to talk it over with his cabinet. Unfortunately, he's also going to involve Zelensky and the Europeans in the discussions, which could be important if they were willing to adopt reasonable positions, but they aren't. I do want to say I could see one potential outcome, well, two other potential outcomes of this summit being, one, Trump rejects what Putin has to say. He says, this isn't going to work for us. This isn't going to work for the Europeans. And that could, I think, potentially lead to the first and the more obvious result would be Trump increasing economic penalties on Russia's trading partners, further dividing the global economy. And I don't think it's going to do the damage to Russia that the Trump administration predicts it will. Second, a possible outcome here is that Putin presents something that's relatively acceptable, that Donald Trump looks at it and he goes, this seems like a pretty good deal for the Ukrainians. And when he goes to Zelensky and says, you know, Russia's asking you to give up the Donbass and they're keeping the territory they hold in southern Ukraine, you're not going to join NATO, and that's that. And Zelensky says no. Well, that could really upset Donald Trump. That could lead to a situation like we saw after the Oval Office confrontation, where maybe Donald Trump cuts off arms and military intelligence to Ukraine, in which case Russia will win the war very quickly. So interesting to see what happens here. Now, one piece to all of this that I think is a problematic is the Europeans are pushing forward with this plan that apparently has approval in the White House to shift the funding for the war in Ukraine from Washington to Europe. Now, this would be somewhat interesting, I guess, if it wasn't the fact that the U.S. was really struggling to have enough weapons in our own arsenal. It's not just that this country is broke. It's that Biden and now Donald Trump have not completely, but largely depleted the American arsenals, our weapons depots. They've sent weapons after weapons to Ukraine and Israel, and now the U.S. needs to refill our own stockpiles. And so it's not very easy to just say, oh, all these European countries are buying the weapons, and so this in no way hurts the United States to sell them to Europe to give to Ukraine. It does in multiple ways. The first, and I think the most obvious, and the one that should raise the most problems for the American firsters, would of course be the lack of weapons in our own arsenals. But other issues are that this could undercut and prevent a deal from getting done with the Russians. Russia is going to ask, as a part of the agreement, Europe stop transferring long-range weapons, the U.S. and Europe to stop transferring long-range weapons to Ukraine. And if the Trump administration is okay with the Europeans buying them and sending them to Ukraine, then we have another issue that has to be resolved at the table between Trump and Putin. All right, last up here, this one just goes to show the sorry state of the Ukrainian military, and a little bit of evidence of what I'm talking about when I mentioned here that there's simply not the weapons to provide Ukraine anymore. Ukrainian military using crop dusters to shoot down Russian drones. And so the Ukrainian air defense systems have become increasingly stretched, and Kiev has now deployed agricultural aircraft armed with missiles to shoot down Russian drones. Ukraine's use of the Zlin Z-137 Agro Turbo armed with R-73 air-to-air missiles was first reported by the War Zone. The outlet explained the turboprop-powered Zlin Z-137 Agro Turbo is seen swooping low over a Ukrainian cornfield, very much its traditional operating environment. In this case, however, it sports a single R-37 air-to-air missile under each wing. The agricultural plane also appears to have received a military-style dull gray overall paint scheme with white identification stripes near the rear fuselage to reduce the risk of friendly fire. The Z-137 was first developed in the 1960s and was in production until the mid-1980s. Russia often fires massive salvos of missiles and drones at Ukraine overnight. Ukrainian forces have struggled to repel the barrages as their air defenses have become increasingly strained. President Zelensky has frequently appealed to Ukrainian backers for more air defense systems. However, stockpiles of conventional air defense systems, such as the US-made Patriot, are stretched. This has led Ukraine and its allies to develop a number of ad hoc air defense systems, and Kiev uses its fleet of F-16s to shoot down incoming missiles and drones. Ukraine is also facing a shortage of manpower. Zelensky recently signed a law allowing Ukrainians over the age of 60 to continue to serve in the military. All right, next up here, moving on to the Korean Peninsula, U.S. reactivates military intelligence unit on Korean Peninsula. Wrote this one for the Institute on August 12th. The Pentagon activated a military intelligence unit in South Korea. The move comes after the U.S. established a second fighter jet super squadron on the Korean Peninsula. So, according to a statement from the U.S. Army, the 528th Military Intelligence Company is now operating in South Korea. The 528th will be a part of the 2nd Infantry Division. So, this is a statement from the Army. The 2nd Infantry Division is the last remaining permanently stationed division in the U.S. Army. Its purpose is to deter aggression and maintain peace on the Korean Peninsula, and if deterrence fails, fight tonight in support of the U.S. Republic of Korea alliance. The 528th was established during World War II and was then deployed during the Korean War. The 528th was disbanded in 2005 after deployments during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. According to the statement, the 528th will be utilized to collect, analyze, and disseminate information about enemy forces, terrain, and the potential threats to support decision-making and assure mission success. The reestablishment of the Military Intelligence Company follows the Pentagon repositioning dozens of F-16s in South Korea closer to the demilitarized zone. Additionally, Washington and Seoul are set to kick off large-scale war games that often lead to a spike in tensions on the Korean Peninsula. However, the U.S. and South Korea have agreed to divide the war games and will conduct half of the planned military exercises in September. And so I wanted to just mention here that the U.S. and South Korea are saying that this has nothing to do with politics on the Korean Peninsula. This isn't about trying to appease the North Koreans. This is about there being a massive heat wave in Korea that's supposed to last throughout August, and I guess they want to conduct some of the war games in September when the conditions are cooler. That seems like a ridiculous excuse for the U.S. military, to me, to be quite honest. And I really heavily speculate that they are dividing the war games in an effort not to upset Pyongyang too much. An additional factor that I do wonder if it's maybe going to tap down tensions on the Korean Peninsula over the next month or so is the summit between Trump and Putin. The North Koreans are holding calls with the Russians ahead of Putin going and meeting with Donald Trump to discuss that. My understanding from reading Russian media is that the North Koreans did not or do not expect Russia to deliver any kind of message to Donald Trump or to like kind of involve themselves in the diplomacy. I do wonder though if Putin would maybe advise Kim Jong-un not to do anything too provocative while he is discussing and trying to end the war with President Donald Trump in Ukraine. On the Kyle Anzalone show, not long after Trump took office, I interviewed Joe Twillinger, who is a real expert on these issues on North Korea. He's been to North Korea several times. He's met with Kim Jong-un several times. And he kind of laid out that you almost have to resolve the situation in Ukraine before the North Koreans can expect the situation on the Korean Peninsula to, or at least the tensions to be eased at this point. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here over the next month. I do anticipate talking about North Korea more often over the next few weeks here. All right. This one I wrote for JudgeNap.com on August 12th. Netanyahu says he's on a historic and spiritual mission and seeks to create a greater Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed that he felt he was on a historic and spiritual mission. He said he has visions to create a greater Israel. In an interview, Netanyahu was asked by former Israeli lawmaker Sharon Gal if Prime Minister had a vision of greater Israel. Netanyahu replied, "Very much. Some Israelis' vision of greater Israel includes Gaza, the West Bank, along with large parts of Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, and even portions of Iraq, maybe Kuwait." It really stretches, I guess, what is that, the Euphrates River, all the way to the Euphrates River in Iraq, and then down onto the Persian Gulf, which would be Kuwait, the northern part of the Saudi desert, the Egyptian Sinai and the Nile River Valley, and then southern Lebanon and most of Jordan and Syria. So I have no idea what vision of greater Israel that Benjamin Netanyahu has since, I want to say, spring of 2024. It was Amos Hochstein, who I believe was the first U.S. official who I heard say that there were historic opportunities to reshape the Middle East. And at this point, I became very concerned that Israel was not only looking at annexing Palestinian territory, the occupied territories of the West Bank, of Gaza, but also expanding into southern Lebanon. Now, this obviously includes southern Syria. And so as Israel maybe has more short-term success, you wonder how big Netanyahu's ambitions grow on this. I am very concerned. Not only, I think it's a foregone conclusion at this point that they are going to annex Gaza and the West Bank during Trump's administration. I just worry that it's going to expand far, far larger when you hear Netanyahu making statements like that. Additionally, Netanyahu seems to have the near unconditional support of the White House. In an interview with Axios on Monday, President Trump provided backing for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plans to escalate in Gaza, suggesting Israel needed to ramp up pressure on Hamas. The report said that Trump stopped short of directly endorsing the Israeli government's plan to take over the Gaza city, but seemed to agree with Netanyahu's argument that more military pressure on Hamas is required. And if this again is Trump's thinking, Trump's approach, we're in trouble here. We are going to just keep giving more and more support to this genocide and Israeli territorial expansion. So what's going to happen with the Palestinians is, you know what, I actually want to do this story first. This one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on August 13th. Netanyahu says Palestinians will be allowed to exit Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attempted to spin the ethnic cleansing of Gaza as an act of humanitarianism. The Israeli leader said he was working with other countries to take in Palestinian refugees fleeing this war. In an interview with I-24 News, Netanyahu was asked, "Do you believe we will eventually see emigration from Gaza?" He replied, "I don't understand this question at all. Why does Gaza have to be a closed place? In other war zones, millions left. Suddenly they are determining that here in Gaza, the civilians should be imprisoned. First of all, inside Gaza, we are not pushing them out either. We are allowing them to leave." Now, Netanyahu is lying on both claims. First of all, the Palestinians cannot leave Gaza even if they wanted to. Israel has erected buffers along all of Gaza's land borders, and essentially, if a Palestinian attempted to go within a half mile of any of Gaza's land borders, they would be murdered by the IDF for crossing into a no-go zone. And so there is simply no way that Netanyahu could just be like, well, why don't they just leave like a Syrian or a Ukrainian did? Right? If Russia was bombing the borders of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Polish border, Hungarian border, Romanian border, then it would be much harder to say that Russia was allowing the Ukrainians to leave, right? This is obviously absurd that they have them blockaded in. They have the strip under siege. They don't even allow them to touch the seas of the Mediterranean, right? And yet Netanyahu is saying, well, if they want to leave, they should just leave. That isn't an option. Now, the other lie is saying that we're not pushing them out either. They're absolutely pushing them out. They're intentionally destroying all their homes. They're starving them to death. They're destroying the hospitals, the schools, the mosques, the cemeteries. Everything that makes Gaza a Palestinian territory is being erased. And so, yes, obviously that does mean that Israel is pushing out the people as well. While Netanyahu absurdly presents Israel's as a passive actor in its own war, many humanitarian aid agencies have blamed Tel Aviv for intentionally creating a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Additionally, the Israeli Prime Minister recently ordered the IDF to expand operations in Gaza with the goal of occupying the entire strip. When asked why Palestinians are not exiting Gaza at a faster rate, Netanyahu said, "You need receiving countries. We are talking with several countries. I can't detail that here." Now, one of the countries that Israel is reported to be talking to is South Sudan. This one from Dave DeCamp, August 12th, antiwar.com. Israel is in talks with the South Sudanese government about possibly moving Palestinians into Gaza, Palestinians from Gaza into the East African country. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli officials have been open about their desire for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian population of Gaza, but so far they haven't found countries willing to accept the large number of refugees. And again, the Palestinians don't want to go, and these countries don't want to be a part of the ethnic cleansing, the genocide of the Gaza, the Palestinian people. Now, one thing I want to mention here is I think any of this is going to require the U.S. We are the world empire. We're the ones that would have leverage, the military support to give to South Sudan, Syria, Somalia, Libya, any of these countries that they propose sending the refugees to. The U.S. is really the country with the leverage to make that happen. And so I'm guessing the U.S. is going to be involved for it. Now, this is important. The IDF chief says he's approved plans for the conquest of Gaza. And this is important because Israeli officials are attempting to say, oh, no, we're not taking over the whole strip. We're just going to go get our hostages that are in Gaza City, when the IDF chief is making it clear that this is about the conquest of Gaza. It's about taking over everything in the strip. All right, this article I wrote for the Institute on August 13th. 2 UN experts listed Medicide, or the deliberate eradication of the healthcare system, among crimes committed by Israel in Gaza. A statement by the UN Special Rapporteur on Health and Francesca Albanese, the Special Rapporteur on Palestinians, and they explained in a statement, in addition to bearing witness to the ongoing genocide, we are also bearing witness to a medicide, a sinister component of the intentional creation of conditions calculated to destroy Palestinians in Gaza, which constitute the genocide. Health and care workers have been continuously targeted, detained, tortured, and are now, like the rest of the Palestinian population, being starved. Deliberate attacks on health and care workers and health facilities, which are gross violations of U.S. law, of humanitarian law, must stop now. The World Health Organization has reported 735 Israeli attacks on medical facilities in Gaza since October 7, 2023. Over 900 medical personnel have been killed, and 34 Palestinian hospitals have been damaged. In a 2024 report by the Institute for Palestinian Studies, defined Medicide as the destruction of a healthcare system in whole or in part, with the aim of obliterating or damaging the conditions needed for saving and sustaining the lives of the sick and wounded. The UN experts called for an immediate ceasefire and accountability for Israel. They said the disregard towards the crimes Israel continues to commit in Gaza renders a stark message to the world that the people of Gaza do not count and their lives do not matter. Palestinians in Gaza are being denied their right to dignity, existence, and to food, the statement explained. All right, this one here, I thought it is a more important story than I think people realize. Something that hasn't gotten hardly any coverage in the U.S. UK legislators press government to reveal if British spy planes recorded the killings of 6 Palestinian journalists in Gaza. And so what we have here are 2 members of the the UK Parliament demanding that the government of Keir Starmer release or at least disclose if they have surveillance images of footage of the Israeli airstrike on the medical tent outside of the Al-Shifa hospital that killed 4 Al Jazeera journalists and 2 freelance journalists, 6 journalists in total in a single strike. Now, the reason I think this is important is because there is a massive amount of data about what's happening in Gaza that's not controlled by Tel Aviv. It's controlled by Washington and it's controlled by London. And so if enough pressure can mount that we could force our governments to release this information, it would reveal evidence of war crimes committed by Israel with American weapons, of course, but it would be almost undeniable, right? It would not be from Palestinian sources. It would be from Western governments that are just showing what Israel is doing in Gaza. And so I think there needs to be a larger press, probably more so in the UK, probably more chances of success there to get to get that information out, to get that evidence out, because I'm guessing the UK has collected a lot of evidence of Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Next up here, Australia to recognize Palestinian state. I wrote this one for JudgeNap.com on August 12th. And, you know, this is just the Australia joining the UK, France, and Canada, all close U.S. allies, and 150 other countries around the world, and saying that they will recognize a Palestinian state at the upcoming UN General Assembly summit in September. This isn't going to be groundbreaking, transitioning, but I think it does reflect the growing consensus, even among U.S. allies, that what Israel is doing is unacceptable and something must be done. Now, wrapping up here with this story, I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on August 13th. UK, France, Germany prepared to trigger snapback sanctions on Iran. The European parties to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal are threatening Tehran with a snapback mechanism that would reimpose UN sanctions on the Islamic Republic. Iran has warned it will withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty if the UK, France, and Germany, or the E3, attempt to revive the sanctions. A Financial Times report published on Tuesday cited a letter from the E3 to the UN threatening to reimpose the snapback sanctions should Tehran refuse to resume talks related to its nuclear program. The statement said, "We have made clear that if Iran is not willing to reach a diplomatic solution before the end of August or does not seize the opportunity of an extension, the E3 are prepared to trigger the snapback mechanism." The snapback mechanism was included in the Iran nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, as a way to impose sanctions on Tehran if it attempted to weaponize its nuclear weapons program or breach the international safeguards regime. Under the agreement, the US, EU, and UN sanctions were lifted in exchange for strict limits on Tehran's civilian nuclear program. The UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, or International Atomic Energy Agency, has verified that Tehran was in compliance with the agreement on 11 separate occasions by the time Trump unilaterally exited the pact and reimposed all U.S. sanctions and even increased them on Iran in 2018. in response to the U.S. economic war and Israeli attacks on its nuclear program, including a wave of assassinations targeting Iranian scientists going back more than a decade. Tehran has broken the limits on uranium enrichment imposed by the JCPOA, but has not attempted to develop a nuclear weapon. American and Iranian officials engaged in several rounds of dialogue earlier this year aimed at establishing a new nuclear agreement. Those talks were scuttled when Israel launched an unprovoked war on Iran in June. Trump joined Israel and ordered attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities during the so-called 12-day war. Since the end of the bombing campaign, Tehran said it would only engage with talks with Washington if it received assurances that the U.S. and Israel would not restart the war during the diplomatic process. Trump has threatened several times to do just that if Tehran does not agree to a new deal. While Iran has engaged in direct talks with officials from the E3, the country's foreign minister explained that those discussions are pointless. With the Europeans, there is no reason right now to negotiate because they cannot lift sanctions. They cannot do anything. If they do snap back, that means the end of the road for them. The Iranian deputy foreign minister previously warned that if the snapback sanctions were implemented, Iran would retaliate potentially by withdrawing from the non-proliferation treaty. All right, that will do it for this show today. But again, go on, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show because you won't want to miss today's interview. Dave Smith at 4:45 Eastern. Check it out. Thanks, everyone.